You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. And welcome everyone to what I believe is now Q&R number 7 for the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. I did not realize it has actually been over a year now since we had one of these Q&R episodes. So I kept talking about it and then we never actually ended up doing it. So I wanted to add in a few more than what we usually put in these just to kind of make up for a little bit of lost time here. And I will remind you all up front, we do love getting your questions in so that we can talk about them. And that's why we don't call this question and answer, because I don't think that too many questions relating to the Bible have one exact answer. There are multiple perspectives, different ways that we can look at things, and I am not here to be a spiritual guru that you have to look to for all of your answers. There are too many pastors out there who think that's their job, and it's not. So it's certainly not the job of a podcaster. So instead, I just like to call it Q&R. I think I stole that from Bible Project, but question and response, where I just give you the best response that I believe I can from the scholarship that I'm aware of. So feel free anytime y'all have a question, whether that is related to episodes that we have already done, episodes that you would like to see us do, or even just topics that are on your mind that are Bible or ancient Near East related, or heck, even faith related. If you've got a medical question or something like that, I'm not going to try to answer that. But if it's within the general realm of faith and religion, I will do my best. So we have some fun ones here today. And I want to get started off with this question of what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? This is a question that definitely does not have a direct answer. The Ark of the Covenant is present in mostly the Tanakh, the Old Testament, when it was created at the time that the Israelites had left Egypt and they are in the wilderness, and God instructs them to build this. We often call it an ark, but I don't always think that is the most useful term. It's not necessarily a wrong one, but the only other time the word ark is used in the Bible is referring to Noah's Ark, and they're actually two different Hebrew words. So they both have the idea of a box, but this is a significantly smaller box. And in fact, people tend to be surprised at just how small aspects of the tabernacle were. So the Ark of the Covenant, as far as we are aware, seems to have stemmed from some ancient Egyptian religiously connected chests, and this was a box that had on top of it the mercy seat, where God's presence was supposed to come down and be represented as dwelling between the cherubim that were on top there. But after the Babylonian captivity happens, we never hear about the Ark again. It does not show up in the New Testament as, oh hey, this Ark of the Covenant is still in the temple. So some people do think that the Ark could have survived Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah around 586 BCE, but there is nothing that specifically states that in the Bible. Part of the reason that many people are inclined to think that it could have survived is because there is a curious absence of any mention of what happened to it. For something that is so significant to the ancient Israelite religion, we would think that we'd have some mention of where it went, but there isn't. When Nebuchadnezzar carries away the vessels of gold to Babylon in 2 Chronicles 36, the Ark is not listed amongst those things. And the list of items returned after the exile in Ezra 1 also doesn't mention the Ark. So really, the simplest explanation is probably just that the Ark was likely among the vessels of gold in the temple of Yahweh that Nebuchadnezzar cut to pieces in 2 Kings 24:13. But no one would pay to see that movie. We don't tend to like that idea. And I understand it. The Ark is a very significant piece of ancient Israelite religion, so it makes sense that people would not want to think that God could have allowed that to happen. So from ancient times until today, people have resisted this idea that God would have let Nebuchadnezzar destroy one of the holiest objects in ancient Israel. And countless theories have emerged as to what could have happened to it. Some draw from biblical events, like some would say that Hezekiah maybe gave it to Sennacherib as a tribute in 2 Kings 18. I find that pretty unlikely. Some say that maybe faithful priests removed it when Manasseh put an idol in the temple. That's in 2 Kings 21. That's possible. What most people are probably familiar with without even realizing it is the theory that Pharaoh Shishak took it to Egypt along the storyline of 1 Kings 14. And the reason that's more popular is because of a wonderful movie called Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark. But that doesn't have much scholarship behind it. Perhaps one of the most intricate theories, and I find this quite fascinating, I'm not necessarily going to say I'm persuaded by it, but I do find it fascinating, is that the alleged son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba actually took it back to Ethiopia. And this is a claim that is taken so seriously by the Ethiopian royal chronicle, the Kebra Nagast, that Ethiopian rulers up to the 20th century actually had to prove their descent from Menelik I, this supposed son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So this is a much more prominent theory in Eastern traditions of Christianity. You're not really going to hear that mentioned out here in the West, but it is a fascinating possibility. And then there are even some from more apocryphal texts, like 2 Maccabees 2:5 actually has Jeremiah hiding the ark in a cave before the Babylonians invade. 2 Baruch chapter 6 describes it being supernaturally swallowed up by the earth, preserved until the day of Israel's restoration. And as tantalizing as any of those theories can be, I kind of lean on the not so pleasant thought that the ark probably was destroyed. And I look to Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 16 and 17 here, which read, "It will come to pass, when you be multiplied and increased in the land in those days, says Yahweh, that they will say no longer, the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. Neither will it come to mind, neither will they remember it, neither will they visit it, neither will that be done any more. At that time they shall call Jerusalem the throne of Yahweh, and the nations will be gathered to it, to the name of Yahweh, to Jerusalem. Neither will they walk any more after the imagination of their evil heart." So this is Jeremiah looking forward to a time when Israel is restored from this pending captivity. But it's the very end of verse 16 that really kind of leans me in the direction that the ark is probably gone for good. And because what the King James has as "neither shall that be done anymore" is actually better translated as "neither will it be made again." And so I think there's a possibility in that by the time of the editing of this passage, the ark was already destroyed, or at very least that they anticipated that that could happen with the captivity, or that they just would not be able to get it back. So I know that can be hard for some people to swallow because, it's such a significant artifact, but I don't think that it's something that is ever going to be found. And I think that if God allowed for the temple to be overtaken and everything else out of it to be taken as well, then it really makes sense that the ark would be among it. So that is not the most popular theory, and it's not very good at selling books, but I think just looking at the biblical and historical evidence, or lack thereof, it's probably the most likely theory. Question 2. Did Nephilim exist after the flood, and could they still exist today? This is right up my wheelhouse. I love this kind of question. And some of you are probably rolling your eyes and going, oh no, not this again. All right, Genesis chapter 6. This is the main passage to go to for Nephilim. And it's kind of one of those, if you know, you know. Some of you are going, what are you talking about? If you have no clue what I'm talking about, go back and listen to our episodes on Genesis chapter 6 before you get into this. It will make more sense. So this is right before the flood happens, and it is describing the state of the earth at that time and why God decided to flood it. And part of the implicit reasoning, it is never explicitly stated this is exactly why God chose to flood the land at the time, but I think it is a significant portion of the reasoning. This is chapter 6, verse 1 in Genesis and following. "And it came to pass, when humans began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God," the B'nai Elohim in Hebrew, "saw the daughters of humanity, Benot Ha'adam, that they were fair." That word fair is tov. It's the word good, beautiful. Think Garden of Eden, right? The tree of the discerning of good and not good. That kind of thing right there. They saw that they were good, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Most translations are going to say wives. There is actually no distinct Hebrew word for wife. It is just the word for woman. Sometimes context will dictate that it more than likely means wife, but here this is more abduction and likely rape. So I would not consider wife to be a great translation there. I would just say they took them females, women. I think wife has too much baggage in our mind of what a modern connotation of that would be when that's not what's in mind here. So they took them women of all which they chose, and Yahweh said, My spirit will not always strive with humanity, for he is also flesh. His days will be 120 years. There were giants, that's that word Nephilim, in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, came into the Banot Ha'adam, the daughters of humanity, and had children, the same became Giborim, mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. So this is the main passage for anything talking about the Nephilim, and it doesn't get talked about in too many churches today because this is a weird passage. It is where you have supernatural creatures mating with human women and creating this really weird, cursed, half human, half divine demigod race. That doesn't exactly preach too well. So it kind of gets skipped over or sanitized, where some preachers will say, oh, this was just godly humans from the line of Seth intermarrying with ungodly humans from the line of Cain. I find that to be a very poor explanation of the text. Some will even say, oh, this was about wicked rulers, human rulers that took from women from whatever tribe that they wanted. I also don't find that very convincing. And part of the reason is because historically, before Christianity and into the early days of Christianity, pretty much every commentator and every other work that referenced this passage talked about it in the sense of spiritual beings. And many times it has been explained as the word Nephilim meaning something along the lines of fallen ones. So the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, are the supernatural beings that came down and mated with human women. The Nephilim are the offspring, the half-human, half-divine demigods. And most people would say that that word Nephilim means fallen ones. There's plenty of debate about that. And if you want more on this than I can get into in 5 to 10 minutes, go check out Michael Heiser's work on the Naked Bible podcast and the Unseen Realm. He goes into way more detail than I possibly can here, has some really good content on it. So the implication in the text seems to be that because the sons of God were existing on this physical plane and then had these Nephilim offspring, God chose to send the flood. And if you look at some ancient Jewish texts that are outside of our Protestant Bibles, but relevant to Jesus and his time, you will find that the authors referenced this happening as a significant cause for humanity to be the way that it is. That it was actually these supernatural beings that led to the fall of humanity and the prevalence and proliferation of evil in the world at that time. So it's reasonable to assume that the Nephilim and any sons of God still on the land at that time would have been wiped out during the flood. However, there's this really weird wording in verse 4 that does leave the door open to there being Nephilim after the flood. And it's where it says there were Nephilim in the earth in those days and also after that. That wording seems to suggest a post-flood existence as well. And Numbers 13:33 also has the spies that went into the land of Canaan mentioning Nephilim. Now, that could have just been hyperbole from them because they were freaking out and they were terrified of the inhabitants. So it doesn't necessarily say in a completely unbiased narrator voice that there were Nephilim. So we do have to take with a grain of salt that maybe the spies themselves were using hyperbole or over-exaggerating as they were freaking out about that. However, it doesn't rule out the possibility. And in fact, once they do get into the land and we read more about the sons of Anak and these various giant clans that are connected with the Rephaim, the Amim, the Zamzumzim, these large beings appear throughout the conquest narratives. At this point, you should be thinking Goliath and his family. There seems to be potential connections between the giants living in the land and these Nephilim offspring of the sons of God. So how could that have happened? There is no description of sons of God, B'nai Elohim, coming down again after the flood. We just have that happening here in Genesis 6. We have an attempt for humanity to make that happen in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babylon, but they are not successful, as far as we can tell. God thwarts their efforts to finish the tower. So where this could have happened again, we don't know. It is not said how this could have happened. There is no mention of it in the text. So there were even some theories that maybe someone with a little bit of Nephilim blood in them was on the ark. Again, no indication of that in the text. It's also possible that if you take a more local flood approach, which again, go back to our episodes on Genesis 6 through 9 on that to see that it is quite likely that the biblical authors were not referencing a worldwide flood, but more so just a localized one. And that's not just liberal scholarship, that is actually good argument from within the Bible itself. If that's the case, then perhaps there were Nephilim in other locations and then just traveled back into the land once the flood had resided. But given that they seem to be part of the reason that the flood happened in the first place, I'm not entirely convinced by that either. So we don't really have a good answer as to how that could have happened. But I do think that the biblical authors are trying to suggest that there were Nephilim in the land after the flood. And part of why I think this is actually really important is because it can change how we view the violence of the conquest of Canaan narratives. If you are reading through Joshua and Judges, there are some really violent passages, particularly in Joshua, where the Israelites are murdering not just the men, but the women and the children of the land that they're going into. And it really seems like innocents are in the way of this Israelite war machine. And that can be really, really difficult to reconcile, particularly as Christians. We look at that and go, how does that mesh with the nonviolent Jesus that we have in the Gospels? Well, this is certainly not a cure-all answer, but if you see the Nephilim as existing in the land and contaminating the land, even after the flood, then it makes sense from an ancient Near Eastern perspective that they needed to be wiped out entirely, that there needed to be a hard reset of the land, a burning of the ships entirely, a salting of the earth, if you will. And if they are not entirely human, if they are part human, part divine, that could also take away a little bit of the edge of the violence against seeming innocence there. It could be that the entire race was corrupted. I think that's the idea that the biblical text is trying to get across. I know that's not the picture you get in church. I know that's kind of controversial, but I do think there is good reason to believe that the biblical authors had that in mind. And I also think that with David's conquest of the land, there are a few passages that seem to have him specifically rooting out giant clans. And I think that the idea there is that he was wiping out the last of the Nephilim. And there's this whole really weird thing, too, that you can get into with some of the apocryphal literature, where it seems like the spirits of the Nephilim, or possibly the sons of God, when they die, go on to be the demons that inhabit the land at the time of Jesus. And that is why Jesus has such a prominent ministry as an exorcist, because he is completely ridding the land of any remaining Nephilim influence. So I tend to see that as the mindset that the biblical authors had, but that is up for debate. There are plenty of good Christians who would disagree with me. And part of the problem with taking that view is that some Christians will look at that and then demonize people today based on the fact that you can look at the Nephilim and say, oh, they weren't fully human. And then we can use that as a precedent to start treating other people that way as well. In fact, if you were to look up the Nephilim online, you're going to end up in some really weird corners of the internet really fast. And there are people who believe that the Nephilim could still be existing today. And it kind of coincides with like the lizard people running the government conspiracy theories. Like it's this idea that powerful people, usually pedophiles, are actually not fully human and they are running the world and all this. So it gets into really fringe stuff with cryptids, aliens, conspiracy theories, but all of that lacks any credible support. And I do not see that in line with the gospel message of seeing all people as being able to be redeemed. I think that that just leads to a spirit of fear. So even if you do take a position similar to what I do, remember that the Bible is trying to present that the Nephilim were fully wiped out at the time of David, and that any remaining remnant of their power in a spiritual form was taken care of in the time of Jesus. So this is not really something that we need to worry about or be trying to hunt out. In fact, I would actively argue against that because it can cause a lot of harm. So TLDR, I do think that these chaos beings seem to have existed again after the flood, according to the biblical narrative, but they have been wiped out long ago and is not anything that we should be looking for or worried about today. So question 3 comes from a very interesting angle that I wanted to share. Somebody asked, you often talk about how ancient people saw the sky as water and how they were just using their cultural understanding of the day, but we have a better understanding of it today. If they were closer to creation, why would they not have had a more quote unquote pure understanding of the way the world worked than we do? Why do we have to assume that our knowledge is actually better than what they had? That's a legitimate question. And I want to be clear in saying that ancient people were not less intelligent than we are. They were just working with less information and different frameworks. This is an argument that sometimes I hear today, even in politics, particularly against people who are a little more left-leaning, a little more progressive, is they'll say, it seems like you are completely abandoning your heritage and everything that people have worked on before you, like you're standing on the shoulders of other people. You can't just go do this on your own. But I don't actually know anyone who really thinks that way. It's not that we are saying everything from before us was wrong. We can only say that things before us were wrong because the things that happened before us happened. We build on that. The idea is to get better with every generation. And that doesn't mean that the generations before us were stupid just because they got some things wrong or didn't know some of the stuff we know today or didn't have some of the inventions that we have. The very fact that we have those inventions and that knowledge and that science today is because we are building on what has come in the past. So this is not to say that, oh, we're better than them because they thought the sky was made of water or whatever. No, not at all. They were working off of what they had, and that's really what science is we work with what we have and we make theories and we test them and we try to be less wrong as time goes on. So when ancient people looked up at the blue sky, it resembled water, and rain came down from it occasionally. The sky above was blue. What's the other big blue thing that you sometimes see? Water. The sea. This was not just primitive thinking. It was reasonable observation without modern tools and mindsets. But we do have to remember that the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the way that they viewed the world, it was phenomenological. In other words, it was based on phenomena that they could observe rather than scientific in our modern sense. It wasn't about trying to test and get to an exact replicable truth. It was more just about trying to make sense of what we see around us in a relatively coherent fashion. And we have to remember that the Bible was not a scientific textbook. Ancient texts were often more concerned with theological and functional truths than they were with scientific accuracy like we would have today. Our mindset is a product of the Enlightenment. It's really only the past few hundred years of human history that people have thought like this at all. And yes, we can trace it all the way back to Greek and Roman thought, but it's really a relatively modern way of thinking that we have. So we have to remember the ancients were not trying to do meteorology when they talked about having a rakia, a dome, or as the King James would say, a firmament above the earth. They were just describing the enchantedness of the world around them as they saw it. And God was not trying to give the ancient biblical authors supernatural understanding of the ways that the world worked. He used their cosmology. He used the idea of the four ends of the earth, or the four winds of the earth, or the sun rising and setting. There was no point at which he said, oh, in order for this to make sense, I have to give you correct scientific knowledge that actually the earth revolves around the sun instead of the other way around. And hey, as somebody who is very factually minded and tends to be kind of pedantic about stuff like that, sometimes I wish that he had. But that wasn't the point of the Bible. It wasn't about getting scientific accuracy. That's the problem with creation science groups, is they're trying to shoehorn in modern mindsets into an ancient document. And that's not to say that the Bible is erroneous or that it's sloppy or cannot be trusted. No, we just have to let it be what it is without trying to make it something else. If you tried to use the Bible as a cookbook because there are a couple of recipes in it, you would end up with some disgusting food. Ezekiel bread, anyone? People have actually tried this. It doesn't work because the Bible isn't meant to be a cookbook. Just because it has statements about food in it, or ingredients in it at times, does not mean that that is the purpose it is meant to serve. Same thing with science, same thing with history. We have to be careful not to treat this as something that it is not trying to be. And there is no reason to believe that God gave the early humans supernatural understanding of how the world worked back then. It's not like if Adam and Eve had stayed in the garden that they would never have had to have learned anything. What's the point of living if you don't have to learn anything? For any of you superhero fans out there, think kind of like Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. Like, he just gets so bored of life because he doesn't have anything left to learn. He has seen all of time, and he exists in different points of time. And so even when he is doing something as personal and intimate as lovemaking, he is off doing other things at the same time because there's nothing left to learn. There's nothing left to experience. There's nothing left to enjoy. That's not how God created humanity. So just because they were closer to creation than we were doesn't necessarily mean that they had a better understanding of how the world worked. And again, that's not to say that we are better than them. It's just to say that we have different tools and different questions and different ways of understanding the world because we are building on the shoulders of those who have come before. With the Bible study that I do, I use Logos Bible software. I have right here to my left a computer screen with the power of 1,000 Bible scholars. Just 100 years ago, people who wanted to really study the Bible seriously had a handful of books that they had to spread out on a table and search with their finger until they found exactly what they were looking for in each page and compare and contrast back and forth. I have all of that in the click of a few buttons, exponentially more than what they ever could have even imagined possible. Not to mention the discoveries that we have had in archaeology and biblical studies since then that help us understand the world of the Bible better. Does that mean I am smarter than the Bible scholars from 100 years ago? No. But it does mean that I have better tools. I have better access to things that may make my study occasionally more accurate than theirs. But that's only because I am indebted to the work that they did that got us to a point where we can have something like Logos. So it is worth respecting what came before, but also acknowledging the intended purpose and the fact that since we have built on the past, we can sometimes have more accurate information, and that is a God-honoring way to use the skills and intelligence and experience that he allows us to have as humans. Question 4 is really well thought out, and actually the only time so far that I've ever been asked this question. Was Yahweh ever portrayed as a sun, S-U-N, like sun in the sky, in syncretistic Hebrew practices? So let me just explain here in case any of you are going, huh? When they're saying syncretistic Hebrew practices, what they mean is that if you were to look at the Bible, specifically the Torah, like Levitical law, all of that, you see very clear instructions on worshiping Yahweh alone and how it was to be done in ancient Israel. However, laws are only written when people are not following the laws. So the fact that we have so many portions of scripture with the authors and the editors and sometimes even the prophets saying, don't do XYZ thing, that should tell us as students of the Bible, people were doing XYZ thing. They would not have written a prohibition about it if they weren't worried that people were doing that. So as we study life in ancient Israel, through especially archaeology, we learn that they really did draw on the cultures and religions of the people around them. And the average Israelite was not living the religion that we see in the Bible. The religion that is in the Bible for ancient Israel is an ideal. It is written by priests that wanted the people to live like this. It is not indicative of the actual reality of the average Israelite back then. They had very syncretistic practices where they were kind of a hodgepodge of multiple religions. And that makes sense. I mean, we even see that being written in the Bible. That is the impetus of so many stories where Israel is combining the Levitical religion with other religious practices, and the priests and the prophets get pissed about it and try to correct them. So going to the actual question here of was Yahweh ever portrayed as a son? It is debated. Scholars are not 100% sure, but it is quite possible. Both El and Yahweh seem to have origins in other religions. Now, we use those names interchangeably for God today. Technically, El is not as much a name as it is a title. It is just the Hebrew word for God. But if we go into certain Canaanite religions, El also seems to be the actual name of a god in the Canaanite pantheon, and kind of goes back and forth with Baal, or we would often say Baal. And then Yahweh, which we have as the name of the God of the Bible, is also present in some other religions. And that kind of makes sense because you have Abraham responding to the call of Yahweh with no explanation of why he thought that this was a good thing to do. It seems to suggest to me that he probably was already familiar with Yahweh in the religion of his area of Ur. You have Melchizedek, who was not at all related to Israel and yet was familiar with Yahweh. And we even have passages that, oh my gosh, they are debated back and forth so much, but we have some obscure passages that suggest Yahweh may have come from southern regions below Israel, and even some others that say he could have come from the north. Again, these are highly debated, but scholars tend to think that the Israelites were not the first people ever to worship El or Yahweh, but that there were actually other people groups before them that did. And again, that makes sense biblically. There was no Israel before Abraham. But does that mean that no one from Adam to Abraham ever worshipped El or Yahweh? No. His existence was known in other areas and got incorporated in with different religions. So going back to the idea of being represented as a son, the first thing that came to my mind is Psalm 84:11, which does say that Yahweh God is a sun and shield. Malachi also spoke of a son of righteousness. And I think a lot of Christians hear that as S-O-N because that kind of gets connected to Jesus. But if you actually look, it's S-U-N, the son of righteousness. And Ezekiel had, oh my gosh, Ezekiel had so many weird visions. But in one of them in particular, he saw priests worshiping the sun from within the temple. This is in chapter 8. Michael Heiser did an episode of this on his Naked Bible podcast, though if I remember correctly, it has been a while since I listened. I think he unnecessarily tied it to a misunderstanding of a modern Jewish blessing, so if you do listen to that, just keep in mind, I think he kind of went a little off the rails on the way that he explained that one. But he did make the case in that episode that the priests could have been worshiping the sun as a representation of Yahweh, not as a separate god to replace Yahweh, but actually as an idol that represented him. Nothing in the text explicitly says that they thought they were worshiping any god other than Yahweh with this sun representation. And that makes sense to me because I think this is what happened with the golden calf incident in Exodus as well. When Aaron pulls out the golden calf and says, "These are your gods, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt." Well, they had heard from Moses that Yahweh was the God that brought them out. And there is nothing where he specifically says, oh yeah, this God is actually called Apis, and he's the real one that brought you out, not Yahweh. No, there's nothing that says you're worshiping the wrong God. He just gives them a new representation of the God, and it could have been connected with this worship in Egypt, depending on the timeline. But I think many of Israel's idolatrous episodes throughout the Tanakh were not replacing Yahweh with a different God, but actually attempts to give Yahweh a recognizable form rather than worshiping a different God entirely. And that makes sense when you are dealing with a God who said, I don't want a representation of me made, I don't want an idol of me made. You can have a hard time relating to that God. He can feel distant and not as connected. And so the history of Israel in the Bible, and I would argue even Christianity today, has been of replacing Yahweh with things that we think represent him, but actually are not fair representations of him. And again, the very fact that you have Ezekiel and these other prophets and priests writing against sun worship suggests to me that people were doing it. But in all fairness, it is hard to know how much of that could have been connected with Yahweh at any point in history. So that one, I'm going to say possible, maybe even probable, but pretty darn near impossible to verify for sure. Question 5 is fantastic. Love this. If Jesus was Jewish, why are we Christian? Straight into the point, and it is a great question. Today, Christianity and Judaism are completely separate entities that often don't see eye to eye on doctrine. If you were to go to a synagogue service on a Saturday and to a Christian church service on Sunday, you're going to have two entirely different experiences, even if they had the same passage of scripture that was being read. But Christianity's roots are entirely Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. All 12 of the apostles and most of the disciples that followed Jesus were Jewish. Most New Testament writers were Jewish. Easter connects to Passover. Communion reworks the Passover Seder. Baptism was a Jewish ritual from the Second Temple period. Over half of our Bible is solely Jewish scripture before Christianity ever even existed. And as you read the Gospels and Acts, the early church was almost entirely Jewish. Are you tired of hearing me say that yet? I firmly believe that Jesus and his followers were not looking to start a new religion. They retained Jewish culture and just reworked it. They still observe Jewish feasts, holidays, customs, and the Sabbath. Think about Jesus, who said, I didn't come to abolish the Torah, but to fill it full, to fulfill it. They just added meeting on Sundays with others who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. They were not trying to create a whole different religion. Obviously, that is what eventually happened. And I tend to think that a misreading of Paul has led to much of the separation of Christianity and Judaism over history. Paul wrote extensively about the relationship between the Torah, what we often call the law, and grace. And many have read this as his saying that the Jewish religion was bad and needed to be replaced with Christianity. But Paul still preached in synagogues. He still kept Jewish vows. He didn't reject his Jewish culture because he started following Jesus. He just integrated in his new beliefs about Jesus into his pre-existing faith in Yahweh. But as time went on and the Jesus movement spread, the ratio of Jewish to Gentile followers, Gentile just being non-Jewish, it quickly shifted. And by the time of Augustine and Constantine, and just 300 years after Jesus, Christianity was the state religion of the Roman Empire, the very thing that crucified him, the very enemy of Christianity, had now become what Christianity was. And they started actively trying to forcibly convert Jews over to this belief system. So much of Christian writing became very anti-Semitic at this time. And during medieval times, the church not only tried to convert Jews, but often killed those who wouldn't convert. And thankfully, we have stopped most of that outright anti-Semitism today, but those mindsets still remain underneath a lot of how we unconsciously approach the Bible. Christianity is at its strongest when it draws on its shared roots with Judaism, not trying to blend the two into one, but in recognizing the original context. In reality, we are not meant to be two different religions, but rather just two sides of the family tree. We started off as siblings, and now maybe we're second cousins twice removed, but we still have those connections going back, and we as Christians would do well to remember that and respect that as we interact with our Jewish siblings. Question 6 is a fascinating one. Was time measured differently in the Bible? Particularly in regards to 2 Peter 3:8, I was thinking, one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Well, many have used 2 Peter 3:8 to argue all different kinds of points throughout the years, but Peter was not trying to establish a divine mathematical formula for heavenly time when he wrote this. 2 Peter was writing to Christians who had been scattered from Jerusalem, possibly during Nero's short-lived persecution. They likely felt discouraged since they had to up and leave family, maybe business, religious affiliations. They probably even felt like God had forgotten them, much like the Israelites in their Babylonian exile several hundred years earlier. So Peter's statement to them was not a specific formula, but actually a general encouragement. Even when we feel that too much time has passed for God to act, he's still at work. We can get so focused on life as we perceive it that sometimes we feel stuck in a rut forever. But God, existing outside of time, can step in at points as if no time had passed at all. And Peter is also quoting slash alluding to Psalm 90 verse 4, which also makes a similar point about God's eternal perspective as opposed to our human mortal perspective. So I would not say that time was measured differently in a divine sense, but it is worth pointing out that calendar systems were a little bit different in the ancient Near East at that time. Many were lunar based, while our calendar today is more solar based, and you had some lunisolar stuff going on as well. There are differences in how many days were in a month or months in a year, but the general passing of time was measured without too much variance from what we're used to today. So that one I'd say, not really. Time was pretty much still measured the same way, just in slightly different systems. 7 is a really fun one. Could Paul's thorn in the flesh have been related to psychedelic use, possibly causing something like HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder? Now, what they're referencing specifically here is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul writes about this whole experience that he just says a person had. A lot of scholars believe that Paul himself was in view here, that he was just speaking in third person about himself. But he talks about being caught up into the skies and having this weird supernatural revelatory experience. And then he says in verse 7, lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of this revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of the Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. And for this thing I prayed Yahweh thrice that it might depart from me. And he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Paul writes then, more gladly, therefore, I would rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. This is the only reference that we have to this thorn in the flesh that Paul talks about here. And the only real reason that a lot of people think it was eye-related is because he mentions in a different letter that he is writing with large letters. But that is a different letter in a different context. And there's different ideas of what exactly that could mean. Something that we don't tend to realize a lot of times is that these letters were not often just something where the person sending the message just sat down and wrote it from beginning to end and then just sent it out. Rather, they would often use an amanuensis, a scribe, somebody who would write for them, because writing was not something that the average person knew how to do back then. And so they would hire someone to do it. They would probably give them the general idea of what they wanted to say. The scribe would come out with a first draft, give it back to them, say, all right, what do you think about this? And then they would make edits along the way, and this would go back and forth until they finally say, okay, that's good, that's the final draft, let's go ahead, copy this, and then we'll send it out to however many people that we need to. And this seems to be what happens with the epistles in the New Testament as well. In fact, we have what I tend to think is the best evidence of this in, I forget exactly which letter it is, but there is an instance where Paul says, I am grateful that I didn't baptize any of you there except for this person and that person. And then he goes, oh yeah, and also the household of this person. And if there was anyone else that I forgot about, them too, kind of thing. And that, I think, is an indication of the different drafts of his letter, that the first time he said, okay, these are the only couple people that I baptized. And then when they came back for another draft, he had thought, oh, darn it, I forgot to mention them. Throw that one in. And it just keeps going on and on like that. So if Paul used a scribe, which is highly likely, and I mean, even basic Christian tradition has often thought that Luke may have been a scribe for him, then it would not make sense for his writing with large letter to be a reference to his own writing if he was not the one writing it. It could possibly be like a signature of his at the end, or maybe he just wrote a little bit of the letter to show that was different. So what seems to be the case at the end of Galatians, where he says this about writing in large letters, is probably that it was just in like bold typeface, to put it the way that we would have it today. Like he put this in bold italics and underlined to get the last point across that he was trying to make. So there is no clear indication that the thorn in the flesh of 2 Corinthians 12 is an eye-related issue. It could be anything. And I tend to think that this is more so just a hyperlink back to some passages in the Tanakh where God is said to block the way of Israel with thorny thickets. This is like Hosea 2:8. There's also Numbers 33:55, where oppressors are said to have splinters in the eyes of Israel, or thorns in Ezekiel 28:24. So I think he's more just using the idea of something that is inhibiting him and making it harder for him to exist. This is some sort of chronic illness, whatever it is. Now, could that be related to psychedelic use, and particularly having this like HPPD where there's lingering effects on eyesight after certain really bad trips? That seems less likely to me. Ancients definitely did use psychedelics occasionally, and sometimes even in temple practices, but that is more related to central temple cults rather than individual prophets or priests, or in this case, apostles, because Paul was neither a prophet nor a priest. So there are theories that pop up occasionally that prophetic visions were drug induced. I am not always opposed to the idea. I mean, if you have ever read the book of Ezekiel, it's kind of hard to think that he wasn't tripping on something in some of those visions, but it's nearly impossible to prove that in any case with any likelihood. And I'm not sure how much access Paul would have had to any psychedelics, especially since he was not a priest or prophet. I can't prove that he didn't ever use them, but we also can't prove that he did. So I lean on the side that that is probably not what he was talking about. Even though it's not impossible, it's nothing that we could ever prove definitively. And our last question for the day. How do we know if the Bible came before other cultural texts, myths, stories, or the other way around? This is a really important question, and I have heard this brought up a couple of times when I have taught through some of the ancient context of the Bible, particularly like when I connect biblical stories like in Genesis to the Epic of Gilgamesh or Atrahasis or Numa Elish, things like that. And sometimes people who have been taught that the Bible is a wholly unique document get a little uncomfortable when they realize that there are a lot of parallels to other ancient stories from that time. And so it's been brought up, well, how do we know that the Bible didn't actually predate those stories and that those stories were copying the Bible? It's a fair question, and a relatively easy one to answer as well. A big part of that is the dating of the manuscripts that we have. We have some manuscripts of other ancient stories that predate the manuscripts we have of biblical stories. And we also can tell just from historical timelines that these other cultures existed before the Israelite culture did. So since the Bible, and particularly the Tanakh, the Old Testament, is the story of Israel, it makes sense that cultures that existed before Israel would have their own stories before Israel did. And particularly since the Tanakh as we have it today was edited together in the Second Temple period, kind of the post-exile, but before Jesus, we can see the ways that those authors drew on pre-existing older mythologies. And there are theories about how much of the biblical texts were originally oral traditions well before they were written down. That was more heavily relied upon in scholarship a few decades ago. It's kind of falling out of favor a little bit now, where scholars aren't emphasizing the oral aspect as much, but it definitely was a thing where these stories would have existed in oral form before they were written down. But we still have records predating the biblical accounts. And we saw this even in things like recently in our Exodus series, where I mentioned a few ancient Egyptian stories about a night of the slaying of the firstborn. And it's super enigmatic. Like, we really don't know what's talking about. It's a few lines and really small broken fragments of text. But those fragments that we have predate not only the earliest manuscripts of Exodus, but also predate when the Exodus could have happened, even in the earliest possible dates, by a couple hundred years. So the Bible is not a wholly unique document. We need to sit with that. We need to be okay with that. That's not me trying to destroy anybody's faith. That is me saying, if we want to have genuine faith, it has to be built on truth. And it has to be built on the reality that the Bible did draw on the cultures of its day. But that is not the same thing as saying that the Bible copied from those mythologies. And it certainly doesn't mean that the Bible is less important or less authoritative or less divinely inspired just because God allowed pre-existing cultural narratives from around Israel to influence the stories. We have to remember that the Bible engages in comparative mythology. It's not so much about the biblical authors copying these stories from other cultures as it is they're responding to them. Because these other stories already existed, the biblical authors came in and said, okay, you have heard how the Egyptians say the world came about. You have heard how the Babylonians say we should behave. You have heard how the Canaanites say how the gods interact with humanity. Now it's time for us to tell you our version of the story. So many of the biblical texts that are connected to other ancient literature, they tend to be polemic or reframing this common cultural inheritance between the people groups. So we do have to be careful not to make false assertions about the wholly other uniqueness of the Bible as if no other cultures had mythologies and stories of how the world works and stories of how gods interact with humanity, or even stories about El or Yahweh. All those things did exist, and many of them pre-existed or came into existence around the same time as the biblical stories. But that should not scare us. If you come from a more fundamentalist background, it may make you uncomfortable at first, and that's okay. That says more about the fundamentalist background than it does about the Bible. It goes to show how much of our faith we have based on traditions and assumptions instead of what is actually in the text and learning good Bible scholarship. We can still hold high regard for our sacred scriptures, and I believe we can actually hold higher regard for them when we acknowledge them for what they are. Because this kind of thing is super fun to study, to learn about, because it makes these texts come alive. It shows that they didn't exist in a vacuum. It helps us to appreciate the culture of our own day as well, because God found things to play with and respond to in the culture of their day. And so it shows that those people weren't just living in a bubble, and neither should we. Our job is not to hide from culture or to villainize or demonize culture, but rather to work to shape it as well from the inside out. Well, I hope you have enjoyed walking through these questions here. They were not really arranged in any particular order, and there wasn't much of a theme to them, but that's okay. We love getting your questions, and remember, you can submit them any number of ways. You can email cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can write in on the homepage of our website, thebibleuncut.com. You can come on our socials. You can hop on the Discord that we have linked in the show notes of all of our episodes. And YouTube as well is a great place to send in questions and comments. So we love hearing from you. We love to have these questions keep coming in so we can do these a little more frequently. I will do my best not to let another year go by before we do Q&R number 8. So until then, though, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.